you're a Maine humorist.
Yes, I am.
And you're a man of many sorts of talents.
It's like everything else in Maine. You got to do 6 jobs to make a living. You got to kind of do a lot, wear a lot of different hats if you're going to make a living.
But you're a familiar face around Boothbay Harbor.
Yeah.
And I know you were born in Fort Fairfield, right?
Yeah.
But you grew up here in Boothbay Harbor.
I moved to Boothbay Harbor when I was about 4 or 5 years old. So I went to kindergarten and graduated from high school with the same 37 kids. So that's pretty much your hometown, I'd say.
And we know the old name Sample well because of Sample's shipyard.
Yeah, that was my dad. My folks were divorced when I was a little kid. My mom remarried. Frank Sample was my stepdad, and he adopted my brother, my sister, and I legally, so we're all Samples. I've got a bunch of siblings and 4 sisters and 2 brothers, so there's a bunch of us floating around.
So how was it? What was it like growing up? Did you grow up kind of immersed in the shipyard? Was that a big part of your life?
Well, you know, the harbor, the waterfront. I loved, you know, I was, you know, at the formative years when I arrived and it was all new and exciting. And the harbor back then was really, I would say growing up in the 50s in Boothbay Harbor wasn't all that different from growing up here in the 30s or 40s. I mean, it was working waterfront. There were 5 shipbuilding operations right here in the inner harbor. And there was all kinds of the freezer plant, big fish processing plant on the east side, and very little tourism. But there were these big residential hotels like the Oak Grove, it used to be here, and the Village Inn was right here in the middle of town, and New Agony, and all these places. So you had a different whole sort of sense of tourism. It wasn't gift shops and day trips so much as it was people would come for the summer or come for a month or come for a few weeks with the family out Squirrel Island and Southport. So it was quiet and fun, and I had a wonderful time. I felt like I was a kid in the candy store. It was really fun.
So you grew up, you mentioned your brothers and your sisters.
Yeah.
How did you fit into the family? What role were you? Were you the youngest?
I was the acting out, I was the black sheep of the family. I was the second in birth order, second boy. I had 3 older stepsisters, but yeah, I was a classic, talk to any comedian in America, and they were all class clown. They all flunked out and got kicked out, dropped out, and had all kinds of, you know, problems because we're non-traditional thinkers. You know, I was always into everything and had tons of imagination, but there'd be 12 letters after it if I was to be tested today. It's probably, you know, like I say, I always say that the entertainment business is like a sheltered workshop for all these OCD, and you know, you get somebody that plays guitar 24 hours a day, like a little OCD there, you know.
So at an early age, did you realize that you were a humorist, so to speak?
Well, what really happened, really, honestly, was I loved entertainment. I love comedy. Like a lot of kids, boys developmentally, particularly boys will do this. I memorize stuff. I memorize record albums. The kids do this today, but I would memorize people like Shelley Berman and Alan Sherman and Tom Lehrer, and I would recite these things. And you know, the idea that you could put words together in a way that would get a rise out of people, and particularly, again, with the class clown thing, I knew I was bright and perceptive, but I also knew that I was not a good student. What my skill sets were not what was being tested for or looked for in the classroom, and so that gave me an area to achieve. And I remember vividly when the Beatles came, you know, the British invasion started, and it was '64, I guess, when they had that famous press conference in New York. And you have to remember that, so I was like 13 years old in 1964, and the Beatles were like in their 20s, they were grown men. But in those days, a press conference was a very staid affair. It was adult men and women in suits and dress clothes and very staid. And so he had this press conference. I remember seeing this, and you know, they asked John Lennon, how do you find America? And he said, turn left at Greenland. And I'm thinking, these guys, this is a job, they get paid a lot of money. I want that job. That sounds like, it was like the first grown-ups I saw that had a job that I thought I could do this. So, you know, I started a band like everybody else, but it worked for me. And I was a singer in the band, and I wrote songs. And so a lot of what got me going as a monologuist was playing in bands and interacting with the audience, being the lead singer and whatnot. That's how I got started. Some of the hardest working people on the Maine are fishermen, loggers, and stuff like that. And they do not want to be fiddling around with your vacation. And they don't want to be talking to you about what you're doing on your vacation. Folks don't realize this, and it gets going pretty hot and heavy. I remember when I just was a kid over there at the co-op called Dougie Tanner. How many knows Dougie Tanner? Okay, wait a minute. I forgot, I should have mentioned this earlier. As we go through the evening, every now and then I'm going to ask you a question. Like, do you know Dougie Tanner? When I ask them questions, I'm not interested in the truth. Why should I care? I don't care if you know Dougie Tanner. I just want to feel like you're with me, or I'm not going to care. Try it again. How many knows Dougie Tanner?
That's interesting that you brought up this kind of new change that was coming about, and this was in the 60s, and we all know this we're on the brink of this cultural revolution.
Yep.
Did your humor ever play out as kind of radical? Was it seen as radical around this part of Maine?
Oh yeah. Well I went to, I somehow managed to stumble through high school and get a diploma. And I was artistic and creative. I'm an illustrator. I've illustrated, I think, 14 books or something like that to date, and a lot of other artwork stuff. So I had this artwork thing going, and I went to what's now Mecca. Back then it was the Portland School of Fine and Applied Art. And so I was 18, it was 1969, I was in Portland, there was a lot of hip stuff going on, there were a lot of bands, and by that time I graduated from Tom Lehrer and Shelley Berman to Firesign Theater and Conception Corporation and Frank Zappa and the Mothers and you know, all that kind of stuff. And so I did a lot of, as a matter of fact, when I was 20, I actually performed, I had a duo called Deaf Ted, Some People That Are in the Sound of My Voice, and that's from a John Lennon poem from John Lennon in his own right called Deaf Ted, Danuta and Me is the name of the poem, but Deaf Ted was the name of the group. It was just me and a guitar player, brilliant guitar player named Steve Cawley. He had a big Gibson ES-335 and could play just brilliantly, kind of a Mark Knopfler of his day. He could just play amazing stuff. And so I played a crutch. I took a crutch and slung it on a guitar thing and played like air guitar and a crutch, and I had a holster with fake fruit in it instead of a gun and stuff like that. It was just very avant-garde, and so we did all those kind of, but again, a lot of the rudiments of people in their teens and 20s playing music, there was a lot of broken guitar strings and people tuning up and amps that blew a fuse and rowdy crowds, and so I had to learn to entertain the crowd to keep everybody's attention while all this stuff, the fight was breaking out over at the bar and the motorcycles were pulling in and everything was going around. So I cut my teeth on that kind of environment.
So yeah, that's funny because you say you kind of really started off as this musician, right?
Yep.
But you kind of evolved, and you've always been kind of an artist. You were drawing
Yep.
and such, but you evolved, and this was kind of the genesis of being a storyteller.
Well, what happened, really, the big shift, I always figured, people told me ever since I could remember, Timmy, you have to decide, are you going to be an artist or a musician or a comedian, or you've got to pick one. And the way I figured it, well, if I drew pictures and somebody paid me for them, I was an artist. If I played music and somebody paid me to do that, I must be a musician. I mean, they can figure it out. It didn't bother me. It seemed to bother other people. It didn't bother me. And in point of fact, as I've gone through life, I've noticed that most of the people that I know that have a strong, they're novelists, but they paint, or they write, or they play music, or they do photography. Everybody that's not that unusual. But I was glad that I never really took much stock in that. I just went ahead and did whatever. But fast forward to 1976, I'm 25 years old, and I got a job opening as an opening act for Paul Stuckey from Peter, Paul, and Mary. And that was a big deal. And Noel, his name is Noel, and Paul was a name that was kind of made up when they had to make it because Peter, Noel, and Mary didn't sound good. I think Albert Grossman came up with the name, but whatever, Stuckey, I met Stuckey, and he had just had a big hit with the wedding song. He was really big time, world famous. And for whatever reason, we just hit it off. And we still, this is, say, 39 years we've been playing together. Almost every year for 39 years. And he produced my first few albums. The whole story there, there's another whole story. But anyway, Stuckey, I opened for him, and we got to be friends, and I opened for him again. And I did that a few times. And I moved down to Blue Hill. He was living there, and we started New World Animation, me and Stuckey, and a couple of them. I did animated cartoons, and I continued to perform with him music. And then Mallet got involved, and he produced Mallet, Dave Mallet's first album. This is all, we're all just, I mean, I'm in my 20s, and this is all like a fairy tale for me. But I remember it was about 78, 79. We were on tour, a little few shows around Maine, maybe New Hampshire. But it was me and Stuckey and Dave Mallet and this group called, well, it used to be called Two Guys from Boston. Eddie Motto and Vic Hyman had a band, and Ed Motto was a great guitar player. I don't know if he's still around, but he played with John Lennon. He was really a great. But anyway, Stuckey it was at the Maine State Music Theater in Lakewood. Stuckey took me aside before the show. We were rehearsing the day before the show. He said, "Look, I got to tell you something, Tim." He said, "We got all these guitar players right in a row, these Caucasian male acoustic guitar playing singer-songwriters. This is like 5 in a row." He said, "It's kind of not the best lineup." But he said, "You have this other skill where you can make people laugh." And he said, "I'm going to suggest something. Maybe you could go out and leave the guitar backstage and just go out and MC, do a little shtick, do 5 or 10 minutes, and then introduce the next act and do it like that." And that was a big crossroads for me, because he said, "You can do anything you want. Either way, it's fine with me. I'm just making a suggestion." I had seen his gold albums and platinum albums, and I know he played, you name Royal Albert Hall, the Budokan, the Sydney Opera House, Carnegie Hall, the Hollywood Bowl. They played everywhere, so maybe the guy knows a little bit of something about show business. So that's what got me into doing the stand-up, and a year later, Peter, Paul, and Mary got together in 78, so that must have been early in 78 that happened. And they were on tour in Australia, and we were working on animation in Blue Hill, and Noel got back, and he was roaming around the studio at night, and I had done a tape of, I had 50 people come in Geodesic Dome down in Franklin, Maine, and I'd done this recording of an evening of comedy. And Stuckey said, "I heard this tape last night, it's pretty good. What are you going to do with that?" "I don't know." He said, "Maybe you ought to make an album." I said, "That sounds good. How do I do that?" And very few people know, but he paid $5,000 of his own money to produce my first album. And that was, I mean, I don't know if I was making $5,000 a year back then, so it was really a big deal. And Marshall Dodge wrote the liner notes, and, one thing led to another, and all these years later, I'm still doing it.
So all these years.
Yeah. 40 years, 45, more like 45.
So throughout this career, has it always been based out of Maine?
Yeah, I've never lived, or I've traveled all over the place. I think I've added up one time, I've performed in 27 or 28 of the U.S. states and Canada or something, and I've traveled to Europe, and I've been around a few places, but I never ever went anywhere that even remotely encouraged me to live anywhere but Maine. Because for one thing, I kept having these great breaks, and I never went anywhere. I just stayed here. These people kept coming up to me. Charles Carroll called me up, came to my house, and hired me, and I worked at CBS for 11 years. Seems to be working for me. I just sit around here. But the other thing is, I'd meet people, famous people that in show business as I traveled around, and almost everyone, they all wanted a house in Maine. That's like what they really want. I said, I already got a house in Maine, so why don't we just short circuit the whole thing? I'll just stay here. And somebody said, way back in the early 80s, comedy was getting said, if you really want to make it, you got to move to LA. And I remember, so I can't remember who I was talking to, but whoever it was that said that, I said, look, you may not know this, but if they got planes from the Portland Jetport, they go to LA every day. I've been to LA. You can get to LA. It's not that hard to get to LA. Getting a house in Maine, that's a little harder. So if they want me in LA, I go. I'll stay as long as I played in LA, but I got to come back to Maine.
So being this Maine-based humorist and having success and getting these breaks, from being from Maine, what sets you apart from being a Maine humorist compared to all the other kind of humorists?
Well, a couple of things. And that's a good question because, you know, there are different strata. People don't often parse this stuff out, but in humor, just like in music, you can follow a kind of a family tree of music, of the influences of R&B and gospel and, you know, African drum rhythms and, you know, Irish jig music up in the mountains of Appalachia. You can see how these things and people know there are these there's bluegrass music, there's R&B, there's all this. Well, the same kind of thing happens in comedy. There are different types of comedy. And the storytelling tradition, which has deep, deep roots in the state of Maine, is an influence on people like Mark Twain and people like Garrison Keillor. And this, I always say, American history reads from left to right. So a lot of this stuff, Charles Farrar Brown, who was born in Waterford, Maine in 1823, I want to say, he was Abraham Lincoln's favorite humorist, and he was the inspiration for Mark Twain. He inspired Mark Twain to do what he did. So what I like about this kind of humor, first of all, I'm familiar with it. I grew up with it in the same way that you get somebody like Doc Watson that grew up with some kind of finger pick. And I grew up listening to this oral tradition and these wonderful stories. And they have a cadence and they have a kind of a thoughtful insight, dry as a bone. And, you know, like I said on one of my early albums, if you find yourself sitting through the whole program, it ain't that it ain't funny. You just don't get it.
Took them the better part of an hour to get back that time. At that point, I thought perhaps they could use a little intervention. I went over and I says, you fellas lost, are you? Well, they said yes. And you trying to get off on Southport Island, are you? Well, they said, yes, yes we are. Said, you trying to get off on Southport Island by driving west? Well, he said, that's exactly what we've been doing. He said, there's your trouble. He says, you can't get off of this island by driving west. If you was to do that, you'd be the first ones that's ever done it. He said, if you really want to get off of the island, go take a tip from an old timer like who's been around here a little bit. You want to take that car of yours, you want to turn it 180 degrees, head it in an easterly direction, and drive back across the same bridge you come across to get on the island in the first place. They said, we didn't come across no bridge. Oh, he says, I take it back. I take it back. Your trouble is you ain't here yet.
What I like about it, what I always liked about it is you have to pay attention. There's a lot going on in there. But it's not this, and it doesn't condescend to the audience in a certain way. There's a certain kind of comedy that I find vulgar. Frankly, I just find it vulgar. It's assaultive, it's combative, it's like, it's almost angry, and it's like, oh, yeah, you idiot, and what about this? It's a very, and of course, in the 40 plus years I've been doing it, when I started out, nobody used remotely the kind of language that everybody used. And I find that baffling. I do, I find it baffling. You know, I listen to, I like Julia Louis-Dreyfus, and I watched that Veep show. It's a very clever show. Every other word is the F word, and I'm thinking, why? what meaning does it? It's like saying It's like too many ums. But at any rate, so I just stayed the same, which has turned out to be strange because now in today's world it's like an oddity. People can't even imagine. Like they say, oh, there's this guy and he's funny and he does it. Really? What would that sound like? I have no idea what that would be like. So it's kind of weird. But what I've always loved is I think humor is a medium for communicating any kind of truth, but often very difficult truth. Funny stuff, especially in the New England storytelling tradition, and I talk about this on stage, we use humor not as a means of avoiding reality, and certainly not as a bludgeon to beat up on people. People say to me, like, well, we're going to have a roast for this guy that's been in a... And I say, oh, you want me to stand up and make fun of people? I'm not your guy. Get somebody else. I would never do that. I wouldn't embarrass anybody. But so it's not a weapon, and it's not a means of avoiding reality. It's kind of a lubricant. You look at the Maine humor canon, all the topics, the long, hard winters and black flies and muddy roads and potholes and frost heaves and obnoxious tourists and all the difficulties. And we find, and even I talk about the fact that in Maine, the mariners working on the water, like we call it, and working in the woods, those are two of the most dangerous, difficult. You can lose your life, you can lose your limb. They're very dangerous. And that's where the funniest stories come from, because it's a way of coming to terms with things. And that's really what, before there was any writing, before anybody had, papyrus, scrolls, they sat around and told stories. And the stories were entertaining because that's the medium. That's how you want to entertain. But they always had a message in there. And it was something interesting and important, and it was about life.
Actually, used to have the old ones with the lands on. Well, that was a popular item for tourists because they looked good at the lawn down in New Jersey, I guess. But Dougie was hard working. One day, guy comes out, poking around the door, walks over to Dougie, says, I'm just wondering, think I'd like to get one of these, take it back down home and they put on the lawn. How much do you have to get when you turn like this one right here? Douglas barely looks up and says, look, is that one? Oh, he said, I imagine I probably have to get $50 for that. Well, a fellow thought that was kind of steep, just a wooden trap. And he said, well, I think that's a little steep. I think I'll poke around, look a little more. Doug says, suit yourself. He poked around a little more, and he found the old beat up. It was all stove in, had some fish heads in it, barnacle. He thought he might get a better deal on that. He went up to Doug, he says, now, we get $50 for the other one, how much you want for this one here? Oh, Doug said that one, I'd have to get $100 for that. Says, I don't get it, how come you charge twice as much for the old beat up one as you do for that brand new one? Oh, he said, that's easy. He says, that old beat up one belongs to me. I don't know who the hell owns it. So I like that. I like to hear that, and I have this Stephen King book. Steve called me up. I've known Steve for 30 some odd years. We met, actually Steve and I met, this is the new one. I don't know, this is probably, if you can see this on camera. It says Stephen King in really big letters, and in tiny letters it says read by Tim Salmon. Like this. But Steve's stuff is wonderful, and he called me up. He wrote this. This is his first foray into Maine humor, and he called me up last December and he said he had this story, and I just narrated it for Simon & Schuster, and it's coming out. It's a story that's set on the 4th of July 2015, so it's this 4th of July. So on the 2nd of July at midnight through the 4th of July at midnight, Simon & Schuster Audio is streaming this all over the world of me narrating this Stephen King story that takes place on a lake in Maine, and it's a feud between year after year fireworks from a local family and a family from away, and there's a lot of Allen's Coffee brandy involved, and it's pretty funny, but it's funny in a kind of a
tongue-in-cheek, dry Maine way that's just kind of wacky. There's a message in there. And I like that.
Anyway, I got this job with the local affiliate to do a TV special, and what we did, we filmed it on the last week in June. It was this week, 1998. How many years ago is that? You do the math. It's too long ago. It was a long time ago. And all I did was I borrowed a '68 Cadillac convertible from my friend John Lee at TV Motors over there in Brunswick. And I got the film crew to follow me, and I drove this old Cadillac, and all we did for 3 days was we drove down Coastal Route 1 last week in June and interviewed tourists about natives and natives about tourists. That was it. That's the whole concept right there. You know, in some states, that wouldn't work. In the state of Maine, it's a gold mine. I mean, you know, how can you miss when you have a place like the prison store in Thomaston? You know, not every state in the Union has a prison store. And we don't even have the prison there anymore. This is what I love about Maine. This is what I love. This is the essence of Maine humor. Okay? It's just a little bit weird. It's not super weird. It's not far out. It's just, it takes a little while to figure out how weird it is. Now, we were driving along, we pull up in front, you know, the prison store, it's right on Route 1. I mean, right on it. There's not even a sidewalk on it that way. We're in a vehicle, it's flat, yeah, you know. We pulled up, we unloading the gear, the guys that had to move the car, and I started looking in the picture window of the prison store, where the prisoners make the handmade items out of pine, and, you know, furniture, lamps and things, all good, and they make some money, and the people buy it, it's all good. But I started looking a little more carefully, and I noticed right in the center of the picture window, there was a 4-masted schooner about that long, made out of toothpicks. Okay, you look at that, you realize the fellow was not in a rush. Is Freedom's Way. Okay, and then of course, the cops were on our tail and the cars were honking. We had to move the truck, the van there. So they pulled it around back, and there's parking spaces behind the prison store. Have you ever been there? Yeah. Well, them parking spaces, if you look carefully, you know what the signs to tell you where to park, you know what they're made out of? License plates. They was doing it anyway. What do you want? Go back here. Okay, but I will say this. I am a Maine humorist, proud of it, but I do occasionally perform in the western states, New Hampshire and Vermont. And I will confess to you that I have a kind of a vision, and this is more or less of a paranoid, nightmarish vision occasionally comes over me when I'm driving through New Hampshire. Imagine for a moment, that you're driving around the back road to New Hampshire, you get pulled over by a state trooper, you get hauled in, thrown into prison, you're doing 20 years to life for ripping the tags off mattresses or something. And the entire time you're in there, you're stamping out license plates that say live free all the time.
That's good. That's great. And I really appreciate you taking the time to
Sure.
talk with us today.
Happy to do it.
In kind of a last closing question, what advice would you recommend youngsters that are kind of pursuing their passion in the arts and humor haven't had any really fruitful results yet. What would you say to that?
Well, the first thing I always tell people is don't get a day job. Start when you're young and don't get a day job. I am so grateful that I never had a day job. When I was doing stuff, playing in bars and working for nothing and doing all, I didn't have a car. I didn't have a house payment. I wasn't married. And it helps a lot if that's the time to invest in yourself. You got new batteries. You don't know it, but you do. And the other thing is, don't be afraid to make mistakes. And mostly, don't be afraid. What happens in the arts, and it's funny to me, it's actually hysterical. Somebody does something original, and everybody clones the piss out of it until it's dead. And then somebody else does something original, and then they clone that. Do something original. And, the thing that's wonderful about performance art, as opposed to writing, I've written a few books, and it's very hard because there's nobody, all you know is you're cracking yourself up, but you don't know if anybody likes it. On stage, you don't have to wait weeks for them to send in the reviews. When you get out there, I said, throw it up against the wall and see if it sticks. People say, oh, it's commercial. I say, you know what? If somebody buys it, otherwise, what? You and your cat and 3 of your friends, get it out there. Take what you, and then, like with the story I said about Noel Stookie, listen. When people who have been around the block, the arts are an old style workshop, a mentoring kind of, almost like a guild or what's the word I'm thinking of, but where you learn from people who know that have been down ahead of you. It's like they do being a lobsterman. These lobstermen, they're not going to write a book about lobster. You watch how they do. You do what they do, you'll do okay. You get along somebody like Stookie who's been on stage all his life, pay a little attention. They got a few chops, and you pick that up. And it's like an apprenticeship. That's what I was thinking. And so you've got to have a little humility. If you listen to the greats, you listen to the early interviews of John Lennon, Paul McCartney. They were crazy about Buddy Holly. They were crazy about the Everly Brothers. They memorized everything. Listen to Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan just sounds like he's just imitating Woody Guthrie when he's like 19 or 20, but he kept on moving and he kept on moving. There's nothing wrong with doing, I memorized all these other guys. Kids memorize my albums. I have people come up to me, they know the whole album, backwards and front. They know it better than I do. Find stuff that you like and memorize the chords and the lyrics, and eventually it'll go into the hopper. But I can't stress enough, the time to innovate and the time to invest in yourself is when you're young. And when you have all your energy to commit to it, hey, if it doesn't pan out, you can get a day job later, But I know a young man now who is brilliantly talented, but he kind of got into the business late. And, he's got a great TV show, and I work with him a lot. But it's harder to make the kind of sacrifices you have to make. Now I'm 64 years old. I was doing this full time when I was 20, okay? Yeah, I just soon stay home some nights now, But those times I would drive, from here to Kansas to be 5 minutes on stage. And that's what Bob Dylan says, you gotta get up near the teacher if you want to learn anything. You gotta get yourself next to some people who know what the hell. And Marshall Dodge, the stuff I learned from Marshall Dodge, I couldn't have learned anywhere else. He was a genius. And, if you're not an idiot and you pay attention and you're a little bit respectful, most people in the business will, be helpful. That's the best I could say.
And then after I got finished at CBS News, the first thing I did, after 11 years at CBS, I did an interview with the local public access cable, okay? And what I realized, it hit me. When I'm looking in the camera, at a CBS camera, at CBS News, I'm talking to 6 million people for 5 minutes, okay? Pretty heavy stuff. And local public access cable. I'm talking to 5 people for 6 million minutes. It's